Welcome back to our ISP speaker series. Before starting and introducing our speaker for today, I want to remind you that if you want to keep joining our speaker series, you should send an email to heather.branch@yale.edu so you can be added to our list here. Having said that, we have the honor to have today Professor Xiyin Tang. Professor Tang is a professor of law at UCLA School of Law. She actually received her JD from here, from law school, and she has previously served as a lead counsel for Facebook and an associate for 2 different law firms, where she worked in a variety of transactional and litigation matters in technology, media, and entertainment sectors. It is an honor for us to have her with us here today, so please join me in welcoming Professor Tang.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really a delight to be here today. I'm going to be talking about a new work in progress that I am tentatively calling the coming crisis of creative work. So I'm going to start today's talk by setting forth the intellectual history, the scholarly framework that I'm interested in engaging with, before then discussing my particular intervention and why I believe the scholarly framework is in need of an update to accommodate the way that digital speech is transmitted and received on the internet today. And then I'll end the talk by discussing a bit why I believe this reframing, my intervention, has deep implications for contemporary conversations surrounding artificial intelligence, platform capitalism, and the role that intellectual property has to play in those discussions. So I think it's particularly exciting for me to be here at the ISP, where I was also a student fellow. I can't believe I'm saying this, but over a decade ago. And that is because this project in particular is very much indebted to some of the work of our very own Jack Balkin, who wrote an article in 2004 setting forth, I think, ongoing debates surrounding what he calls democratic culture theory. And of course, Jack was writing around the same time as other theorists like Julie Cohen, Rebecca Tushnet, Larry Lessig, Yochai Benkler, all of whom were sort of pointing to changes in the way that the internet, which was just starting to be used by everyday users to engage in online expression, the way that the internet changed the very nature of speech, thus demanding a new conception of what First Amendment and free expression theory was supposed to do. So here I have a quote at the top from Jack, right, that what he was interested in was this sort of paradigm case that motivated what he called the progressivist or Republican agenda, this idea that political speech was the most valuable form of speech, and that political speech had to be created by just a few institutional speakers transmitting to a mass audience. He believed that that paradigm case no longer accurately described the world that we live in, he wrote. And so what are these shifts that the internet brought about? I think a lot of the literature points at these 3 fundamental shifts. The first is in the type of speech, away from political speech, speech about candidates, towards speech that reflected popular tastes and popular culture and enthusiasms. This idea that democratic individuals weren't just talking about their political candidates, but were also engaged in bits and bobs of culture, in memifying their favorite film, in cutting and pasting and remixing their favorite song, and that in those types of activities, individuals were finding their voice and thus better contributing to an overall democratic society and democratic deliberation. Also, of course, in what other theorists were calling the fall of the gatekeepers, it used to be under the old Republican progressivist model that you had only a few institutional speakers who had the means of even harnessing the technology to speak. You had just a few newspapers, you had a few record labels, a few music publishers, a few studios who owned the pipes and were curating the speech and figuring out what people should be listening and viewing. And the broadcast television at the nightly 7 p.m. broadcast would push out that speech to a mass audience. Of course, the internet, as we know, changes things. So those old gatekeepers, while still relevant, were less relevant because now anyone who owned a computer could be a speaker. You could get on YouTube, start broadcasting yourself, as their motto was. And if, no matter what your enthusiasms, if you just wanted to film a cute video of your cat, or if you wanted to film your baby, there might be some audience on the back end, one or two individuals who were there to receive that speech. So that's a shift from one to many to one, they called it. And then finally, of course, it's in the very nature of speech, away from that focus on only the high quality outputs that those few institutional speakers were concerned with, to a focus on speech that maybe was contingent, that was playful, that was iterative, and in that iterative process, it's in that sense of self-formation that, again, we come to this idea of democratic culture and a democratic society. There's very much emphasis on speech as play. This is Julie Cohen's theory, that in remixing, in what Jack called glomming on, you ultimately formed who you were as an individual and thus as a democratic citizen. So my project engages with what I think is this vastly influential body of literature, but I think that in this framework is missing what I call the pay gap. And so if you think about the nature of the internet and the types of amateur speech that was happening at the very early days of YouTube, it's not surprising that democratic culture theorists largely failed to grapple with how are these amateur speakers being compensated? Should they be compensated at all? Is all speech on the internet de facto free, open, unmonetized, not for profit? Well, certainly in the early days of the internet it was. And in this project, I'm interested in describing what I think is another paradigm shift underway that fundamentally militates a reorientation of this influential body of scholarship before contemporary debates, especially surrounding AI and platform capitalism. So what do I mean by that? So first, and most importantly, YouTube was that early paradigm case. So YouTube was a big example for theorists like Larry Lessig, who in books such as Remix, which I think came out in '06, Lessig kind of pointed to YouTube as this great example of how internet denizens were just flooding the website and posting everything that potentially interested them, and it was all largely done not for profit. Here's the words of YouTube's co-founder, Chad Hurley, emphasizing that fact. We didn't want to build a system that was motivated by monetary reward. Okay, well, fast forward, we're in the year 2024. Everyone, I think, or most people probably have heard of this term here on the right, monetization. This is the term du jour that basically most people think of when they think about how internet speech is made and disseminated today. So I don't know how many folks know this, but monetization was actually a term that YouTube came up with. As it turns out, when you are running a site that's not motivated by monetary reward, when you are acquired by a larger parent company, as YouTube was in 2006 by Google, your balance sheets are going to be really in the red. You're not going to be profitable because you don't have this intention to make money. Well, Google, as a profit-seeking enterprise, was interested in doing something with YouTube that made it money. And so Google, being the king of ads, set about creating a system in which it would start running advertising against the content that users shared on the platform. Well, okay, if you're going to start putting ads in my video, I probably am going to be upset about that. I'm going to say, hey, you, YouTube, you're making money off my video. Shouldn't I get a cut? That's exactly what Google, YouTube promised its users. And when it decided to split the ad revenue that it was making with its most popular users, thus coining the term monetization, which today is understood to mean exactly that. Running ads against content and giving the users whose videos it's running ads against a cut of the revenue. Now, up to now, I've been using the term user somewhat haltingly. You might say, what a person who has a channel on YouTube isn't a user, it's a creator, right? So that's the second bullet I have here, and that's exactly right. So YouTube actually, when it started down the monetization path, also coined a new term to describe exactly those users who were transmitting content on its channels And it said, you know what, you're not just a user, you're also a creator. So that shift in reframing people who are using the platform, not just as these passive users, but as active creators and owners of their content, I argue, has also gradually but surely worked a sea change in the way that these creators choose to not just monetize their content, but also enforce rights in their content. So in the early days of the democratic culture literature, I think the assumption was that anyone who wasn't a large institutional IP holder, anyone who wasn't a Warner Music or a Universal Studios was a user. And generally that assumption was that these users wanted to use other people's copyrighted content. They wanted to upload a video of their baby dancing to a Prince song, and that Prince song was owned by someone else. That's the user. Generally speaking, the democratic culture theorists probably thought that the users were opposed to putting up fences around their property. They were deeply opposed to IP rights. They were deeply opposed to propertization because they wanted things to be open source and free. Okay, well, fast forward to 2024, and what we see in high-profile disputes involving TikTok creators is that actually creators, these very users on the internet, are also interested in fencing off their property. You see this when we look at recent lawsuits that TikTok creators have filed against other companies, alleging what else? Copyright infringement, putting up fences around things like dance moves, around things like the way that their name, image, likeness is presented to the public. Increasingly, these YouTube, but also Instagram, TikTok creators are turning to IP rights to propertize that very thing that at the nascent days of the internet, most theorists had assumed these users on the internet would want to be able to be used for free. Another example I point to in the project is a recent book that was published just a few months ago by the art curator Legacy Russell, who talks about the sharing and propagation of Black memes and other memes appropriating Black culture. Memes are a great flashpoint because I think for a long time, IP theorists had largely believed that those who propagated memes would want them to be endlessly propagated, and that virality without compensation was exactly the point. Right? Memes were sort of held up as this example by those who I think were writing in the vein of democratic culture as an example of how, no, you don't really need IP, right? Because memes just want to be free. As Legacy Russell points to in her recent work, Black Meme, memes may want to be viral, but they don't want to be free. And virality and endless propagation and free and not being paid is not the same thing. And she ends her exhaustive book looking at the history of Black memes with a call for something that IP holders have been doing since the beginning of time, which is a call for royalties. Okay, so I've been talking a little bit about these words open source and free. I have a sub-bullet here. They don't mean the same thing. And what I mean by that is in the early days of the internet, again, there was this sort of boundless optimism that when users took to the internet, they would want everything to be open source and as free as possible. They would want information to be free and to be shared. Recent debates within the open source community are calling into question that fundamental precept because of what else? AI. So, I'm sure as many of you have heard, LLMs, large language models, which are owned by AI companies, have been crawling the internet, looking for whatever information they can find to train their large language models. Of course, all of this is done for profit. Companies like Microsoft and Google are profit-seeking enterprises. And one recent dispute within the open source community, I think, exemplifies the fissures in the assumption that people who may even welcome open source sharing also do not need to equate their material with free, right, as in uncompensated. And so this platform called Stack Overflow, which is where coders go on to share their code in an open source way, rebelled en masse when it was announced that Microsoft had partnered with Stack Overflow to take all that user-uploaded code that was uploaded as open source code, right, in theory free to share, but that ChatGPT was going to start being trained on that code. And the coders rebelled and said this is a fundamental misconception of what we mean by open source. We do not mean that the information can be harnessed by profit-seeking enterprises to make money without feeding any of that compensation back to us. And I'm going to talk about why inherently in the digital age, or maybe dare I say late digital age, all information has value, calling into question that early optimism that information wants to be free in just a little second. But before I get there, I want to talk about sort of the last paradigm shift that I think is salient and pertinent, which is this move from rights holder antagonism to rights holder synergy. So here again, YouTube is the paradigm case. Back in the early days of YouTube, it was a hotbed for infringement. So when YouTube first launched, they made a decision not to license any of the third-party copyrighted content that might appear on its platform, but instead decided to rely on Section 512 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which insulates digital platforms like YouTube from lawsuits, from copyright infringement lawsuits, so long as they engage in a notice and takedown system where if a copyright holder, like Universal Music Group, tells YouTube, hey, this user video uses my copyrighted content, then YouTube would notify the user that it was taking down the video. This notice and takedown system created this adversarial relationship between YouTube's users and big IP rights holders like Universal Music. Right? You don't want to be the user who's getting a notice from YouTube, your video's been blocked and muted and taken down, your link is broken. Why? Because there's this copyright infringement claim on it. It in fact made some folks like Stephanie Lenz, a woman who uploaded a video of her dancing baby set to a song that was owned by Universal Music Group, by the musician Prince, it made her so mad that she went ahead and sued in federal court, arguing, no, Universal Music, you don't have the right to demand a takedown of my video is fair use, right? So that antagonistic relationship in YouTube's earlier days again gave way when YouTube said, we're sick of fighting these infringement lawsuits. Yes, in theory, Section 512 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act insulates us from copyright liability, but guess what? We still have to go to court to prove that we fall within the ambit of the statute. Right, so YouTube, shortly after, was acquired by Google once again. The content owners, a large coalition of them led by Viacom, filed suit against YouTube in federal court, claiming that they weren't entitled to safe harbor protection because there was too much infringement on the site that YouTube knew about. And guess what? You lose protection of the safe harbor if you knew that there was specific infringing content that lived on your site. So years of litigation later, YouTube was sick of the litigation risk and exposure generated by this system of relying on Section 512. And what it did was move to a license-first model. So instead of relying on the statutory safe harbor, they decided to just make nice with the IP rights holders, ones like Universal Music and Warner, and basically enter into extremely lucrative, extremely expensive license agreements with those large rights holders, giving YouTube's users the right to use all the copyrighted content that Universal Music, that Warner owns. What that means is these days, when you upload something to YouTube, you're not going to see, typically speaking, you're not going to see a notice, this infringes someone's copyright, we're removing it. Instead, most content on YouTube these days, just as it is on other sites like Instagram, like Facebook, because it's already been licensed from the IP rights holders, you can just simply log on to Instagram and pick your favorite Sabrina Carpenter song to pair with your video, right? So all of this behind the scenes in which Meta or Google is exchanging cash for licenses up front is largely imperceptible to the user. What the creator sees, what a TikTok creator or what an Instagram creator sees when they log on, is this ability to add synergies to their video by making a song that they are using go viral. And so this happens on TikTok all the time. Old songs like a song by the Cranberries called Dreams went viral yet again, found new life because it was used in connection with a skateboarding video by a popular TikTok creator. So this leads to a fall of the old rights holder antagonism into what I call in my project rights holder synergy, what the cultural reporter John Seabrook calls a collaborative model, in which rights holders and online creators are partners in the chancy enterprise of virality. Okay, so if internet users, creators, no longer see IP as this impediment to speech, because now they can use other people's copyrighted content all they like, not realizing that someone is paying for it somewhere. If they no longer see it as an impediment to speech, then it's not surprising that they've started turning to IP rights themselves. Right? No longer this third-party boogeyman that must be opposed, which was kind of the paradigm case in the development of democratic culture. It's not surprising that we see internet creators turning to IP rights again and again. So if you agree with me, if you agree that there is a fundamental shift away from the not-for-profit, playful, contingent, ersatz, amateur speech that sort of undergirded the early days of the internet when democratic culture theories were just being formed, if you agree that there's been a shift towards what I'll call the professionalization of speech, away from amateur speech, but towards speech that is compensated, that is monetized, what does that mean in the age of AI? So a couple of things. One is that we know that AI is predicted to eradicate large swaths of creative jobs. What I'm interested in is, can the democratic culture theories, which for a long time have been used again as sort of advocating for freeing up property rights, for making more stuff free for all to use, what I'm interested in is, can that theory be repurposed to argue that there is something inherently democratic and thus worth saving about creative endeavors that requires some affirmative state action to help foster the conditions for creativity, even after a lot of those jobs will soon be eradicated by AI. Can the democratic culture framework be repurposed for a right towards creative work? I think it can if you fundamentally re-envision what creativity was all about. Creativity was never meant to be this free, uncompensated, contingent, playful thing. We know that typically in late capitalist societies, most things get monetized at some point, right? So if we understand the paid-for nature of creation on the internet as endemic to the system of creativity, then there has to be an appropriate compensation structure in place as we look at what I'll call the coming crisis of creative work in the age of AI. And then second, of course, that blurring of the lines, that fall between the old IP rights holder on the one side, user divide on the other, now users, creators are increasingly turning to IP rights, I think also exemplifies the fallacy of the original reasoning that information just wants to be free. Instead, what we're seeing in the platform capitalism economy is that information is an unprecedented amount of value. The question will only be who's going to capture that value in information as the years come on and as AI becomes greater and more advanced. Is it going to be a fair assumption that it is probably more equitable for users, creators, those who are generating the information on the internet and putting it out there, maybe originally under some precept that it was all free and good to be shared, but now realizing that if somewhere along the line someone is profiting, and if it's not the user, it's going to be someone else. Right now it's Microsoft and Google. So someone's capitalizing on the information. Are those users going to increasingly turn to IP rights to gain control over the information that is now increasingly being aggregated, extracted, and sold for profit in the information age? So I will open it up for questions in just a second, but before I end, I just want to note, for those of you who had already read the abstract before you came here, thank you, but also you may have noticed that I left out this discussion of news organizations, which is sort of the opening animating example that I give in my abstract. And it's because I'm ambivalent about what to do about the news organizations example, as well as the other big theme that runs through the abstract, which is I believe that it's more important to create jobs than to subsidize particular industries like the news industry. I don't have a real view on whether I think news organizations should stay in or out of this project, but certainly I think what I'm more interested in is capturing this paradigm shift that I just described to you in the talk, and then also thinking through the ways in which this reconceptualization will have implications as we continue our conversations about aggregation and extraction of information in the advancement of artificial intelligence. So with that, I look forward to your questions.
Your talk and the paradigm shifts you're describing made me think about there's lots of parallels with what's happened with data and data collection as well. And some of the same kind of questions and issues and some different. The monetization, how much of that should go to the original source of the data, like if it's data about me, should I get compensated for it? What happens when you have transfers of ownership is another whole set of issues, and they aggregate in various ways and make new things out of it. And data is speech, which isn't part of what you're talking about. So I'm just wondering how much you've looked at that and whether the parallels and the differences might tell you anything, because this is, for me, a new idea. So I haven't thought a whole lot about it, but clearly you have, and I'm curious whether your thinking went in those directions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. I certainly think that these conversations that have been happening in the data privacy space for a while about who owns user data and who's profiting off user data, I think is very analogous. I think what's interesting and maybe new about the past even 2 years and all these lawsuits that we've now seen alleging copyright infringement based on the training of large language models is, we've been having these user data, unauthorized sales of user data for quite a bit, for probably at least 7 years, if not more. And these are all focused on these distinct statutes that are focused on protecting user data and ensuring data privacy. Now we're seeing the debates playing out in exactly, as you say, this analogous manner, but in the copyright space. And I'm absolutely interested in the synergies because you are certainly seeing authors now making the same types of arguments, but in the copyright context saying, guess what, you are aggregating large amounts of copyrighted information and you are using it to train your LLMs. I think what's super fascinating and the parallel between these two areas is that if you ask the companies, they're interested in the user data and they're interested in the copyrighted content, not for the original purpose that we might be interested in our data as a preservation of our bodily autonomy, and for copyright holders or for us consuming copyrighted content, we're interested in those expressive works because we're interested in reading it, right, for the expressive message. To the platforms, this is all just information to be aggregated and extracted, right? They're not interested in reading the book to figure out what's the human message, what's the takeaway, what's the ambiguity. All of it is just information chunks to be digested, and I think that is what links the two. And it's an interesting link that maybe I'll explore in this project, but maybe I'll leave the data part for the data privacy folks, I don't know. But I definitely see the synergy and I think it's an important
Just a point of information, at least in the healthcare data area, it's been going on for at least 30 years.
Right.
So
Yes, in certain industries.
Really new there, although it's getting more attention.
It's getting more attention and it's certainly, I think, getting a lot more legislative action, to combat it. Yes?
Great, thanks so much for this talk. It was very, very clear presentation of this trajectory and where we might be going with it. So I guess my question is really asking you to expand a little bit more about, what you think, perhaps, shooting from the hip, it would mean to re-envision what creativity is about. And just as kind of a counterweight to this, and what I'm thinking with is, I've noticed there's been a recent trend toward, famous musicians selling off their entire song catalog. to like private equity firms, like whatever. And so
Yeah.
people are trying to concentrate more and more of like, more and more rights to different songs. Now that's a little bit different than say if you were to go around and buy, rights to a bunch of different screenplays, right? So perhaps there's or perhaps we need a different account of what this phenomenon looks like for different cultural sectors. But I'm just curious about, your thoughts on the future of creativity, especially in an age when you not only have the sort of tension that you're talking about between, from this adversarial approach, this more synergistic one, but also new actors coming in and accumulating intellectual property at a large scale.
Yeah, I mean, I love this question because I think it captures something that I've been thinking about for a while, which is, I think, especially in the IP scholarship, there's long been this very romanticized notion of who the author is, right? We envision the author as someone who creates alone in the garret. We envision Vincent van Gogh and his severed ear, art is madness, art is genius. Artists are not these profit-seeking businesses, right? But they are instead creating because out of some divine need to make art, even if they end up dying poor and penniless. And I certainly think, if you look at the examples, such as the one you just named, of artists selling off entire catalogs to private equity firms, if you look at the monetization model, if you look at the way that, I have another work in progress called IP as Labor Policy where I talk about this, if you look at the way that most artistic creation happens now in a work for hire exchange, where you show up to the office, you do your creative work, and you sever it from ownership by it's not even an assignment, you basically just agree to the corporate fiction that you were never the author of the work, that the corporation was always the owner under work for hire. That's like something unthinkable under the old conception of IP and moral rights, right? Moral rights theory has been developed under this idea that every artist feels this deep personal connection to their work, in the same way that a parent would feel that connection to their child. There's a lot of like paternalism and moral rights rhetoric, and it would pain me and anguish me to see something happen to my work. Well, 90%, actually over 90% of creative works that are under copyright protection in the United States are owned as works for hire. Okay, so that's not even like I give up my child for adoption. It's like I just acknowledge that this was never even my child in the first place, because that's what work for hire is. It's not an assignment. I'm never named as the author who assigned it over. And I think we have to fundamentally understand that our precepts about creativity have this big gap in which most creativity is about work, right? Creativity has been framed as something, from above, something sublime. It's not just quotidian work, it's something else. I think creativity is work, and it's no different. I made this analogy between creative workers and gig workers in my paper. It's no different as other types of work in which, especially where you're selling maybe bits of yourself, to return to the moral rights rhetoric a little bit, you're selling bits of yourself in exchange for compensation. Yeah, and I think it's an important point, and all these recent developments, including the one you named, goes to that fact.
I'm curious about your open source code example. A lot of open source licenses sort of say that the code has to be used with proper attribution, and many of them also say that it needs to be used non-commercially or in other open source ways. So I'm curious how your Stack Overflow LLM example is different from the ways these open source coders would have been upset about their license violations in the past, sort of like what the transition is to the present, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're absolutely right. If you look at what a Creative Commons license is, so there's different tiers of Creative Commons licenses. The most permissive tier of Creative Commons license, under which some open source coders might choose to put their content up, is just free to use, no attribution, nothing. It's just pure public domain. Other tiers of Creative Commons licenses is exactly what you say. It has to be proper attribution. It can't be used for commercial purposes, etc. I think that in the rhetoric, open source has been historically conflated with that notion of free. Information wants to be free, right? Look, information wants to float in the ether. It should be as free as running water or the air we breathe. Look at all these open source communities who are making their information available without any guardrails. But as you point to, that was always the fiction. There has always been this attribution element to a lot of content that was made available open source. Now we're seeing the disputes rise to the fore with these AI companies and large language models. So yeah, in the past, maybe one person took the open source code, never attributed it as they were required to under the license, and it ended up being, I guess, what in IP parlance you would call it a tolerated use. Right, tolerated use is something that is technically an infringement, but you just tolerate it because it's one de minimis thing, and what am I going to do about it? I don't really care that much. But now that the open source software is being used en masse in a way that violates, I think, the very underlying premises of a lot of these Creative Commons licenses, yeah, this is where you see that, yeah, open source was never meant to be free, or a lot of it wasn't meant to be free in the first place. So that's great. Thank you. Yeah.
I love this, and I love that you're drawing the connections between like previous democratic culture and the way in which AI is doing this. So firstly, thank you for sharing this wonderful project. I was thinking your piece reminds me of two things that I read that I was very compelled by, and I feel like this is like a similar chain of arguments. One is the Romance of the Public Domain,
Yeah.
and the other was actually a presentation at the ISB by a professor in the Gender and Sexuality Studies department, Kalindi Vora. She told the story, which I feel like ties to your AI really well, which is of this artist that asked a bunch of people to draw sheep and then put it together into this like super monetized artwork. But the people that actually drew all the individual sheep got like $2 each. And her book is called Surrogate Humanity, but I'm just wondering, building from that, I feel like there are two things that I heard in your presentation. One is kind of giving people access to what they need for the memeing and the remixing. But the other is, how do you value the work of individuals that are kind of subsumed into the commons? And I was just wondering, who would do the bargaining? Who would act as a voice? Did you, I know that it's hard, you did a beautiful job of communicating a full paper, but I'm wondering whether that part is something that you thought through, or it's a different project.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's two ways of conceptualizing, the commons, I guess, as you called it. So one is that it's a public domain commons and it's free for anyone to use. The other one is, yeah, absolutely, it's more of like an aggregated commons in which a bunch of rights are aggregated together, but there needs to be permissions granted and maybe some compensation. I think in the conversation surrounding AI and fair use right now, there's a lot of the former. It's all fair use, right? If you put it up on the internet, I mean, that was actually, as ludicrous as that argument seems, it was never defense to anything that you found on the internet, but that's actually the AI companies argued, one of their arguments in favor of why they think that the scraping of large sets of copyrighted content for purposes of training their LLMs is fair, because it was all just up on the internet, and it was like, presumably the person had granted some kind of implied license because they uploaded it to the internet. And so they want this former conception, if it's up there somewhere, or if it's even been contributed or published into our corpus of public knowledge, that it's free for any type of use and it's fair use for certain types of purposes. They're interested in arguing that that scraping and training is fair use. The other one is, no, it's actually not fair use. We do need some compensation structure in place. And I think the two arguments are connected, because the more that there are collective bargaining agreements entered into between users who hold copyrights, IP rights, other forms of rights over the information, and the more licenses are entered into play, the less likely it is that the court is going to find fair use. They're going to say there's a precedent out here for a lot of transactions that have been entered into, so no fair use, and vice versa, right? The less likely it is that parties are going to come together and collectively bargain for licenses, then the more likely it is that a court is going to find fair use. And this is a lot of Wendy Gordon's early influential work about fair use and market transactions and market breakdowns. Courts are more likely to find fair use if there's some kind of market breakdown in the system in which the transaction costs are just too high. I don't think the transaction costs are too high in this context. I wrote a paper about the class action as licensing device that was published a couple of years ago, in which I talk about instances in which, even if it's true that it is very hard to individually negotiate, this is, you're like, who's going to do the negotiating? Even if it's true that it's very hard to individually negotiate with every single rights holder, that there are mechanisms in place. If you look at established market mechanisms like the CCC, or even the Authors Guild, those who offer collective licenses already, But then you also look at the use of class action litigation as exactly that aggregation mechanism where you appoint a class action lawyer who's been determined to be able to best represent the interests of the party and have them negotiate out a settlement that basically operates as a license agreement to all the information that's being aggregated.
Just on the earlier point about the original works being subsumed by the generated content that comes after, I guess my question is there any thinking around compensation structures or just on the side of I guess AI generated content and I guess that becomes a content farm polluting the rest of the internet, if how that would work if that's going to be paid towards the original creators that the AI is merging together all the various works, or it goes back to the companies that have operate the.
Yeah, so it's a good question because I certainly think a lot of the digital platforms, when you upload something to the site, they already have a terms of service in place in which you agree that you actually grant them a license to the content. But to my knowledge, no digital platform would say that they become the property owner in that content that you upload. And so I think certainly the compensation should not flow to the digital platform on which it was originally made available, but instead to the author of that speech. And you can see digital platforms right now already trying to find compensation structures, such as Meta recently launched a rights creator program in which you can try to claim your content, and that if it's used as training data, you will get some amount of compensation.
But what happens after many iterations? It feels like it's not super reproducible anymore.
Oh, you mean in the sense that it becomes more commingled?
Yeah.
I think right now that's why all the conversation is about that initial use as training data, and there is very little talk about what happens when that work is then also incorporated in some sense in the output of the LLM. And it's for a bunch of reasons. One is I think it becomes hard because of the, as you say, the commingledness nature of it, the many iterations. And then the other reason is just simply because I think that the AI, the LLMs try to generate outputs that they don't believe incorporate visible amounts of the training data sets, the works that were already used. So they try to generate, in some sense, wholly original outputs. But then your question gets to, are the outputs protectable at all? And how would that be monetized? Right now, under US copyright law, information that is, or content that's generated by AI is not copyrightable. So no one would be able to monetize it. But there's a lot of interest, for obvious reasons, to change that. Not by individual users who might be interested in monetizing their content, but if you think about the primary way that LLMs are used is actually by large studios who are trying to generate entire movie scripts or entire movies using AI. And right now, under the status of the law, they can't protect it, and that bothers them. And they want to try to change the law so that they can copyright that output.
So I'm curious, but I feel like a lot of us have this immediate intuition that we should protect the individual independent content creators when they're kind of put in juxtaposition with the huge powerful money-making corporations. And I'm wondering, how much do you think that intuition forms part of your argument? And if there is kind of a possible counter-argument of a super cynical utilitarian way of saying, but if we just give all this stuff to these huge powerful corporations, they would give us really fast progress in something like ChatGPT and then make everyone happier, So yeah, that's kind of I'm just wondering what you think.
I mean, I guess I would say the latter scenario you point to, in which if we just give them everything, they'll give us super fast progress, is already to an extent what's happening, right? They were able to progress so quickly on the LLMs, on Midjourney and ChatGPT and Bard and the like, or Gemini, I guess now it's called, is precisely because there was a lot of information that users willingly gave up, I think not realizing that maybe they were giving it up with an agreement to not monetize it, or to not be compensated for it. But users have willingly given that up for a long time, and that's why all this information became valuable data sets. So I would say the progress is there, right? It's in the pudding. You see how ChatGPT works and how Midjourney works. I don't think that stemmed the outrage from this innate sense that we do need to be compensated in the same way that for a long time the tech companies have always suggested that they are making all these products for free, because if something is free, you're the product, right? You're the product that is being offered to Facebook when Facebook is being made available to you for free. That hasn't stemmed the fallout from all the user data privacy lawsuits that have been launched against the companies. That hasn't stemmed, I think, the turn in public sentiment. And I do think that public sentiment matters. I think we're talking about earlier paradigm shifts like the one that Jack was talking about, and now we're on this different paradigm shift, right? That's all about, in some sense, how do we engage with the internet, and what's our understanding of how we're participating in this economy? Are we participating with the understanding that's all for play and not for profit and for fun? Or are we participating with the assumption that I give up something, but that thing has value, and if it's going to be used for profit, I want to be compensated?
There are some ways to make money from things that are not propertized in the creative area. The big one is fashion, where fashion is not copyrightable. So how do fashion creators make money? Well, two ways. One is they make things crazier and crazier. It's that stuff you see on the runways in Paris and New York. The other is you go back to older things and kind of rework them in some way or another. But fashion is not only not copyrightable, not property, but it's just ripped off all the time. But nevertheless, haute couture still makes money. So I'm wondering do you think there's any mileage in that model where creators just do things that are crazier and crazier, or go back and rework old things? Those are the two ways I can see would be possible. So have you looked at fashion at all, and that as a kind of alternative? There's another one. It's stand-up comics. They've got some articles about stand-up comics, but there's a sort of a protection in the norms among other stand-up comics, but you're not going to find that in fashion or in the kinds of things you're talking about.
Yeah, I think fashion's a good example, but fashion is sort of unique because it's a combination of real property and IP. So yes, I agree, there's IP and all the intangible ideas that go into making a garment, but of course the actual garment is property, and the couture houses wouldn't make money if you were able to just take the actual item without paying for it. Like, that's the property element.
Yeah, but the thing that makes it valuable is that it's fashionable, that it's a new thing by a particular creator.
Well, I think even there, so my colleague Hal Rossiella has done a lot of this work in the fashion space, where he argues and sort of challenges the IP, the norms under which we need IP, because him and Chris Brickman have argued, look at fashion, it thrives even in the absence of IP. I don't necessarily agree with that, because I do think a lot of the money they make off trademarks, and trademarks is a form of IP, and if you look at the fact that why are the fashion houses so vigilant about going after fakes, it's because if you didn't go after the fakes, didn't assert your trademark and anti-counterfeiting rights, what would happen is there would be some number of people who would say, you know what, this fake thing looks exactly like the real thing, I don't need to buy the real thing.
No, I think you're right about that, but the fakes aren't the issue of copying. The copying comes from Sears Roebuck, and they change it, a little bit, and they don't put a trademark on it.
But I think that's also trademark, because the people who want to say that they own the Gucci version and not the Sears version will buy the Gucci version. If Sears ripped off the design exactly and also slapped a Gucci logo on it, and there's no trademark protection, then certainly why would anyone buy them?
No, you're quite right, but Sears makes money by just selling a whole bunch of Sears products. So in any event, I just wondered if you thought there might be some mileage in making money in the way that the fashion folks do.
I guess I'm just a little bit more pessimistic about fashion as a good example of truly unfettered. I think there's a lot of property rights and fences that go up around fashion, because I do think that there needs to be some sort of cognizable legal right that you would assert in order to be compensated for what you're doing, because otherwise, in the absence of cognizable legal rights, I do think it becomes a true public domain good that then doesn't need to be compensated for. But yeah, it's an interesting example. So maybe I'll give it some more thought about the fashion example. So yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for presenting. So my question has to do with taking your extension of financial compensation to thinking about other ways that, especially in labor, platforms should be or could be thinking about compensating their creators. I did a lot of research in the past about Twitter and basically what happened after Elon Musk's takeover and destabilization, and so I'm thinking about creators as two subsets, as one who gets all of their financial compensation on said platform versus someone who is using a platform to sell something that maybe they're doing in other spaces.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you're thinking at all about what else these platforms might be owing the laborers that are using them.
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I haven't thought about that. Well, so, right, I mean, I certainly think right now, if you think about the First Amendment conversations that are happening around the banning of certain platforms, maybe there's that other element of people do rely on the platform. Some people do rely on the platforms to engage in this type of speech that then goes away if the platform goes away. I think on the what else does a platform owe those who maybe aren't creating copyrightable content on the platform but doing something else, I think that kind of links back to the data protection point that was earlier raised. Because again, if you are using a platform for free, then you are the product. And a lot of the times your data is being harnessed, aggregated, and sold. And I think the groundswell of legislative efforts right now is to stop, in some sense, the aggregation and extraction of that user data. People who are using a platform like Amazon to sell their products, of course, are then giving Amazon valuable information about the types of products that are selling, and you see this debate playing out now in terms of can Amazon use that data to compete with its own users, right? And that's a big topic, and I think there's a lot of other areas of the law and data privacy and in antitrust that are engaged with these concerns about what do the platforms owe the laborers, the workers, the users on those platforms, and I think there's a lot of areas of the law that are looking into solutions for that.
Thank you. I want to build on that idea of the multiple parallels that exist between privacy law and IP, right, on these topics. So what has happened, not in the legislative space, but in scholarship when it comes to privacy, is that they have stopped talking about individual rights. Right? They have been saying, really, individual rights are not going to solve the issue. We have to address this in a systemic way, we have to intervene how asymmetries, and that's why they have started to talk about antitrust, etc., right? Intervening the business models. So I was wondering whether in your space there has been also this type of debate. Maybe the answer is not in the individual rights, but something more systemic as an intervention.
You know, it's interesting because I think that I think the data privacy folks have, had a more antagonistic view of technology than the IP folks, right? Like there's just been, in the IP scholarship, there's been a very, techno-optimist view of technology and its liberating potential for expressive speech. There is very much this positive, yes, it should be fair use. It's in the forward march of progress that we get things like Midjourney. This is great. In fact, I've seen the democratic culture argument sort of harnessed in a different way to say, well, this is great for user expression because now you can create images of 2 cats drinking 5 cups of coffee or something, but I don't know, you see what I'm saying? So it's been very positive. I think to start even thinking about, actually there does need to be more symmetry, you need to start from the precept that it's not all positive progress. There can be harms to individual liberties, individual rights, individual autonomy in the way that how we monetize control, get compensated for the creativity that we share. Before we start talking about collective rights, I have the other paper that I mentioned, the work in progress, IP as labor policy, and a question I always get is like, well, why don't you just let antitrust laws offer all those things that you don't have to worry about? You don't have to worry about IP doing anything, So I think there's certainly that conversation that it's all exogenous to the IP system, and if it's really a problem, some other area of law will step in. Setting aside, of course, that things like the aggregation of copyrighted content to train on the LLMs is uniquely a copyright issue that no other area of the law can solve. But it's an interesting point about the individual rights versus this collective, maybe a collective solution, and I have to think more about that.
Hi, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. And in your abstract and in your presentation, you briefly mentioned news organizations, and you posed the question of whether or not they should be involved in this project. Could you clarify how you see news organizations and journalistic production fitting into this paradigm shift? And also, is the intention to equate journalists as authors to users who are now pushing towards IP rights as a way to find value in order to extract value in their information that they're producing?